I. I was 17 and I babysat for the Hendricks family off and on for about 2 years. And I want to lay out the geography before anything else, because the geography is why I couldn't just leave. And not being able to leave is the whole spine of this. They lived in Nicholas County, West Virginia. I up Dogway about 4 miles past, where the blacktop turns to tar and chip and then to nothing you'd want to take a car up in February. It was a rental, a 2-story farmhouse on a shelf of ground with a bank behind it and a pasture in front that ran down to a creek. Board siding painted white a long time ago. A porch across the front with a hole in the 3rd step that everybody knew about and nobody fixed. And there was one other house within sight, a good half-mile off across the bottom. I and the people in it were an elderly couple named Fitzwater who went to bed at 8. I want to say that plainly. If something had happened in that house at 10 o'clock at night, the nearest awake human being on this earth, was in Summersville, 22 minutes away in good weather. The boys were Caleb, 5, and Ethan, 3. Good kids. Caleb was the serious one, the kind of 5-year-old who asks you follow-up questions. And Ethan was 3 and therefore a small animal with opinions. Their mother worked at the hospital and their father drove a truck for a lumber operation out toward Craigsville, and this particular night was a Saturday and they'd gone to a wedding in Charleston. Which meant they'd be back late, 11, they said, maybe closer to midnight with the drive. I had a cell phone. It didn't work up there. I want that on the record too. Because everybody under 30 who hears this asks the same question. There was no signal in that hollow in 2006, and there wasn't any in 2016 either. And the house had a landline that sat on a little table in the front hall. And I'll come back to that phone. The evening was completely ordinary until it wasn't, and I've gone over it more times than I can count looking for the scene. We had supper. I made them macaroni and they ate it. We watched about half of a movie and Ethan lost interest and went and got the toy piano out of the closet in the front room, which is what he always did, because that thing was his favorite object in the world. I should describe it. It was one of those little plastic keyboards, maybe 18 inches long, made to sit on the floor. 2 octaves, colored keys, and it ran on 4D batteries and a hatch on the bottom. It did not have a demo function. That matters, and I'll say why later. It was the kind of toy where the keys are just keys. You press one and it plays a note, and that's the entire capability of the device. No songs, no autoplay, no rhythm button. And that night I taught Caleb, Mary had a little lamb. I remember it clearly because I was pleased with myself. I'd had 4 years of piano lessons that my mother paid for and that I resented. And here was a use for them. I showed him where to put his fingers, and I wrote the letters on a piece of notebook paper, E, D, C, D, E, 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 that little run, and he got it. Took him 20 minutes, and when he had it, he played it about 40 times in a row the way a 5-year-old will, until his brother was screaming, and I had to say, okay, that's enough, and I put it back in the closet. I put it in the closet. I want to be exact about that. Front room coat closet on the floor at the back, next to a box of board games with a winter coat hanging over it. I shut the door. I remember shutting the door because the latch on that closet didn't catch right, and you had to push it with your hip. Bedtime was around 9. They shared a room upstairs at the back with a set of bunk beds. And the deal was always the same. I'd get in the top bunk with Caleb and Red, and Ethan would lie in the bottom bunk and go to sleep first. And I'd read until they were both out, so that's where I was. Top bunk, back bedroom, second floor, one small lamp on the dresser, reading a Frog and Toad book for the 3rd time, with a 5-year-old under my arm and a 3-year-old asleep 2 feet below me. And downstairs, the piano started playing Mary Had a Little Lamb. I need to slow this part down because the details of it are the reason I've never been able to file it away. And it's not the part everybody expects. It was not a rattle or a random press. It was the song. The whole phrase in order, at about the speed a 5-year-old plays it. Not fluent, but not halting either. It went through once and stopped. There was a pause of maybe 4 or 5 seconds. and then it went through again. My first reaction was not fear. I want to be honest about that because I think it's the most human thing in the whole story. My first reaction was irritation, because I assumed Caleb had gotten out of bed at some point and left it out, and something had fallen on it, and now I was going to have to go down and deal with it. And then I registered that Caleb was under my arm, that his weight was on my ribs, and his hand was on the page of the book, and Ethan was below us, and I could hear him breathing, that heavy 3-year-old asleep breathing. And Caleb sat up. He looked at me, and he said, "Who's playing my piano?" That's the sentence. 18 years, and I can hear it exactly. And the terrible thing about it, the thing I've never been able to convey to anybody, is that he wasn't scared when he said it. He was asking me a question. He had the total, unbothered confidence of a child who assumes the adult in the room has the information. There were 4 people in that house as far as he knew, and 3 of them were on that bunk bed, so obviously I knew the answer. And it played again. Ethan woke up on the 3rd or 4th pass and started to cry. Not hard, just that confused fussing a 3-year-old does when he surfaces and something's wrong, and he wanted to know why the piano was on, and I said, and this is the exact lie I told, I've never forgotten it. I said, it's just the battery. Sometimes they do that. Lay down. I knew that was not true when I said it. That toy did not have a demo function. It had no capacity to produce a sequence of notes on its own. A failing battery in a toy like that gives you a warbling drone or a single stuck tone. It does not produce 7 correct pitches in the correct order with a rest between phrases. I knew that at 17, and I know it now. I have never once found a version of that explanation that holds. Here's what I did, and it's the part I'm not proud of, and also the only thing I've ever been sure was right. I did not go downstairs. I thought about it. I ran it in my head about 10 times over the next hour. The phone was in the front hall. The front hall was at the bottom of the stairs, and to get to it I would have to come down those stairs, walk past the front room, past the coat closet. With the door I'd pushed shut with my hip, and stand in an open hallway with my back to the whole downstairs of that house, making a phone call to somebody who was 20 minutes away. And I would have to leave the boys upstairs while I did it, or I'd have to bring them. Carry a sleeping 3-year-old and lead a 5-year-old down a dark staircase into the part of the house where the sound was coming from. I couldn't. I've thought about it for 18 years, and I still can't tell you whether that was cowardice or the only intelligent decision I made that night. And I've settled on believing it was both. So I stayed in that top bunk. I put my back against the wall, and I put both boys behind me. I got Ethan up out of the bottom bunk and into the top one with us, which took some doing, and he was mad about it, and I kept reading. Out loud. The whole time, that's the part people find strange when I tell it, and it's the part I understand best. I read out loud without stopping for close to 2 hours. Because as long as I was reading, there was a voice in that room, and as long as there was a voice in that room, I could not hear whether there were footsteps in the house. That's not bravery. That's the opposite. I was choosing not to know. It played maybe 9 or 10 times total. It's hard to say because I stopped counting somewhere in there. And then it stopped, and the stopping was worse. Because the silence in an old farmhouse at 10 at night in the country is not silence. It's the refrigerator cycling and the tin roof ticking and the wind coming down that hollow. And every one of those things became something I had to identify. At one point, and I have never known what to do with this, the boys both fell asleep, and I heard the 3rd step on the front porch. That step had a hole in it, and it had a sound. Anybody who came up on that porch made that sound, and everybody who lived there knew it. And I heard it once, at maybe 10:30, one weight coming down on that board. Nothing followed it. No door, no knock, nothing. The parents got home at 11:40. I heard the truck come up that gravel, and I have never in my life been so glad to hear an engine. I heard the doors. I heard the porch, the whole porch, 4 or 5 steps, 2 adults. And I heard the front door and their voices in the hall, and only then did I get out of that bed. I came down the stairs, and the mother took one look at me and said, "What's the matter with you?" I told her. All of it, standing in that hallway in my socks at midnight, and I could hear my own voice doing something odd. She didn't laugh. That's the first thing. She went and looked in the closet, and the piano was in the closet. On the floor at the back next to the board games, and the coat was still over it, and the closet door was still shut. And she stood there looking at it for a second, and then she picked it up and turned it over and opened the battery hatch. There were no batteries in it. Now, I have spent 18 years being fair about this. Her husband was standing right there, and he said, immediately, that Ethan had taken them out weeks ago for something, and he'd been meaning to replace them, and that maybe there was some charge left somewhere in the thing. Some capacitor. And honestly, I don't know enough about electronics to say that's impossible. And it's possible the batteries were in it and fell out. And it's possible I misremembered which closet, but she didn't say any of that. She said something else, and it's why I'm telling this at all. She said, "Did you go downstairs?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Good." And her husband said her name, just her name, Sharp, and she stopped. And she took the piano out to the porch and set it on the rail, and she went and got my money out of her purse, and she paid me, and he drove me home. 20 minutes, and neither of us said one word the whole way. I babysat for them twice more that spring, and then they moved. In June. Sudden no notice to anybody, and the house sat empty for about 4 years, and then somebody bought the ground and pushed it in. I asked her about it once, at a gas station in Summersville in 2011. I'd been carrying that good around for 5 years, and she was polite and she was friendly, and she asked about my mother, and when I brought it up she got very still, and she said, I don't remember that. And then she said we had a lot going on that year, and she went and paid for her gas. She remembered. I watched her remember, and here's what I can't put down. And it isn't the song, and it isn't the batteries. It's that when I told that woman what happened in her house, her first question wasn't, "What did you hear?" It wasn't, "Are the boys all right?" It was, "Did you go downstairs?" You only ask that if you already know the answer matters. You only ask that if there's a right answer. And the other thing, the thing that gets me at 2 in the morning, is that I taught Caleb that song at 8 o'clock that night. Nobody in the world knew he could play it but me and him. It had never been played in that house before that evening. Not once, not ever. So whatever was down there in the dark with a plastic toy in a closet, it hadn't brought that song with it. It had been listening. My mother told me this once, in 2001, in a car, and the reason she told it in a car is that we were driving past the woman's old apartment building in Charleston, and she said, without any preamble at all, that's where Denise burned. I was 14. I made her explain it, and she did, and then she never brought it up again as long as she lived. I got the rest of it in pieces over about 20 years, from an aunt and from my mother's sister-in-law, and from one long conversation with Denise's brother in 2016 that I will get to. My mother was 23 in 1979, and she was working at a doctor's office on Washington Street, and she was, by every account I have, having the best year of her life. She'd come out of Clay County, genuine mountain country. A hollow with 4 houses in it, at 19 on a bus, with about the same amount of ambition and terror as everybody else who does that. And Charleston in 1979 was a real city to a girl from Clay County. It had a mall. It had bars. It had a job that paid every 2 weeks, whether the garden came in or not. Dennis Rowe was her closest friend. They'd met at the office, and they were the same age within 4 months, and they lived about a mile apart. And my mother has described their friendship to me exactly one time, and she said, she was the first person I ever knew that I picked, which is a thing people from hollers understand and other people don't. You don't pick anybody where we're from. You get who you get. Cousins in church and the 4 families on your road, and then you go to a city at 19. And for the first time in your life, somebody is your friend because you chose it. The psychic was in October. I want to be careful about this part because I know exactly how it sounds. It was not a seance and it was not anything spooky in intent. It was two girls in their 20s with a Friday night and $8 each. I going to a woman who had a room above a shop off Capitol Street with a hand-lettered sign. My mother said the woman was maybe 60 and had a West Virginia accent and a card table and a space heater. And that the whole thing was about 15 minutes a person, and that Denise went first because Denise went first at everything. My mother did not remember one word of her own reading, not a syllable. She said the woman told her some ordinary things and she was polite about it and forgot it before they got to the car. But she remembered Denise's, and what she remembered was this. The woman took Denise's hands and looked at her for a while. And then she said that Denise was going to have more money than she'd ever imagined. And Denise laughed. She was making $4.50 an hour, and the woman didn't laugh, and she said, "It's going to cost you everything you've got." My mother said the tone was wrong. She said the woman didn't say it dramatically. She said it the way you'd tell somebody their tire was low. And then she took her hands back and looked at the table and said she was done, and she wouldn't take Denise's money. That's the detail my mother kept coming back to. She gave the $8 back. They went out to the car, and Denise did an impression of her the whole way home, and they laughed until they cried, because they were 23, and that is exactly what you do at 23. 5 weeks later, the building was on the west side, and it was a converted house, 3 units. And it had been converted badly, the way everything got converted in that era, and there had been a gas smell in that building since at least August. I want to lay that out because everything after depends on it. Denise had called about it. The woman in the downstairs unit had called about it. There was a service ticket. This all came out later in the case, where somebody had come out in September, spent about 20 minutes. I found nothing and left. There was a second call in October that got logged and never dispatched. Everybody in that building knew there was gas. Everybody had been told it was fine. That is the whole story of every gas explosion that has ever happened anywhere, and it is why they keep happening. It went up at about 6:40 in the morning on the 21st of November. Denise was in the kitchen. She had gotten up for work. The ignition source was almost certainly the pilot on that stove or the fridge compressor kicking. The investigators never settled it, and it didn't matter to the case. The back half of that house came off. She was thrown through the kitchen doorway and into the hall, and the reason she lived is that a neighbor named Curtis Halstead, a man in his 50s who worked at the post office and who was outside because he was scraping his windshield, went into that building. He went in twice. The second time he came out with her. She had burns over 70-some% of her body. She was in Charleston for 11 days. And then they flew her to a burn unit in Pittsburgh, and she was there for 14 months. My mother went up. Not once, regularly. For over a year, 4 hours each way in a Chevette, every second or third weekend. And she was 23 years old, and she did that. And I did not know a single thing about it until I was 30 and my aunt told me. The city settled in 1983. I don't know the number, and I've never wanted to. The figure that got repeated in my family was millions, and the truth is probably a good deal less impressive than that once you take out the fees and the medical. But by the standards of 2 girls from West Virginia making $4.50 an hour, it was an amount of money that did not exist. And here is where the story turns into the thing I actually can't put down. And it isn't the psychic, and it isn't the fire. Denise got the money, and it cost her everything. And it did not cost her everything in the way you think. She survived. She had, by the count Curtis Halstead's daughter gave me, somewhere north of 40 surgeries between 1980 and 1994. She lost most of the use of her left hand. She could not regulate her body temperature properly for the rest of her life, which is a thing about severe burns that nobody tells you. The sweat glands are gone, so summer becomes a medical event. I. And she never spent another July outdoors. But the money is what did the rest. Because when a girl from a hollow gets a settlement in 1983 in West Virginia, an entire ecosystem arrives. My aunt described it, and she used the word biblical. There were cousins Denise had never met. There was a man who married her in 1985 and was gone in 1989 with a substantial amount of it. There was a brother-in-law with a car lot. There was a church that took an intense and sudden interest in her salvation. There were people from that hollow, her people, the 4 families on her road, who came down to Charleston and sat in her living room and cried and told her about a lien on a farm. And she paid. Every time. My mother said Denise could not say no to a single human being who came to her with a need, and that she had been that way before the fire too. And that the fire and the money together turned a nice quality into a wound that would not close. By 1996, it was mostly gone. By 2002, all of it was. She died in 2011. She was 55. Complications of the burn. Ultimately, that's what it says, and that's what it was, in an apartment in South Charleston. And my mother went to the funeral, and there were 19 people there. 19. In a state where a funeral is a public event and the whole road comes. Now here's the part with Denise's brother, and it's why I've never been able to make this a tidy story about a fortune teller. I found him in 2016. Ronnie Rowe, living in Ravenswood, 71 years old, and I called him because I was working on a family history thing, and I wanted to ask about the settlement, and we talked for about an hour and 40 minutes. He knew about the psychic. Of course he did. Denise had told everybody for years, and it had become the load-bearing story of her whole life, the thing she led with. He said she talked about it constantly in the 80s. He said she believed it absolutely. And then he told me something my mother never knew or never told me, and I have gone around and around on which. He said Denise went back not once. He said she went back to that woman above the shop off Capitol Street 3 or 4 times in 1984 and 1985 after the money came, and that she'd take a cab, and that she was trying to find out how to give it back. Not the money, the thing. He said she had gotten it into her head that the reading had been a transaction, that she had somehow agreed to something in that room at 23 years old for $8. And she wanted to know what she'd agreed to and whether it could be undone. And I asked him what the woman told her, and he said the woman was dead. She'd died in 1981, and there was a nail salon in that space by then. I and Denise went and stood in it 3 or 4 times over 2 years, asking people who worked there whether they knew where the woman went. I've thought about that more than anything else in this. A woman with 40 surgeries and a settlement and a body that couldn't sweat, taking a cab across Charleston to stand in a nail salon and ask a 19-year-old at the front desk about somebody who'd been dead 3 years. And here's what I've come to, and I want to say it plainly, because I think the ghost story version of this does Denise a disservice. I don't think that woman above the shop knew anything. I think she was 60 years old in a room with a space heater, and she looked at a healthy girl of 23 and said the oldest thing there is to say, the thing every fortune teller in every century has said, which is, you'll get what you want and it'll ruin you. It's a good line because it's true about almost everybody. It costs nothing to say and it lands every time. But she gave the $8 back. That's the piece I can't make fit, and I've stopped trying. And what's left, what I actually turn over at 2 in the morning, isn't whether that woman saw a fire coming. It's that Denise spent 32 years believing she had been told. That she carried that reading through the burn unit, and the surgeries, and the marriage, and the cousins, and the empty account at the end. And every single thing that happened to her got hung on it. Every dollar that went out the door was the prophecy working, was the price. I was the thing she'd agreed to in a room off Capitol Street at 23, with a friend she'd picked waiting in a car outside. And nobody ever told her the truth, which is that there was no prophecy. There was a gas leak, I and 2 service calls, and a city that had it in writing and did not send anybody. And after that, there was just money, and the ordinary things money does to a person who cannot say no. She didn't need a psychic. She needed somebody at the gas company to do their job on a Tuesday in September. But I don't know that the truth would have helped her, and that's the part that sits in me. Because if it was a prophecy, then she was chosen. And if it wasn't, then she was just unlucky. And the 70% and the 40 surgeries and the 19 people at her funeral were nothing but paperwork somebody didn't file. I know which of those I'd want to believe. I think I'd want the fortune teller too. I want to start by explaining what my brother's hello sounded like, because everything in this comes down to that, and if I can't get it across, then the rest of it is just a man hearing a noise in a house. Terry was 11 years older than me. He was born in 1954 and I was born in 1965. And that gap meant we were never really children together. By the time I was old enough to be a person, he was already most of the way out the door. But he was the one who came and got me. That's the thing. When our father was in one of his stretches, Terry would come up that road in whatever car he had at the time, and he'd come in the front door of that house, and he would holler it from the hall, before he was all the way through the door. Hello! Long on the middle, dropping on the end, half a joke and half an announcement, the way you'd sing out in a store to see if anybody was working. And that meant we were going somewhere. It meant get your coat. He did it his whole life. He did it into his 40s. He did it when he came to my wedding reception, walking into the fire hall in Richwood in 1991. And about 6 people turned around because they knew it, so that's the sound. I was living in a house at Peters Creek in Nicholas County, West Virginia, that my wife and I bought in 1994. 2-story frame, built around 1920, board siding, tin roof, sitting on a bench of ground with the mountain coming up hard behind it and the creek down in front. It was a good house. We put 12 years into that house, but I want you to understand its position. Because the position is everything. It was 3.5 miles up a county road from the state route, and the county road ran out about a mile past us, and there were 4 houses on it total. Ours was the 3rd. The road went to gravel a half mile below our drive and stayed gravel, and it was the kind of gravel that announces a vehicle. You could hear a car coming up that road from a 1/4 mile off. I could tell you by the sound whether it was the mail carrier or the Fitzwaters truck. We had a gravel drive off that road, 40 yards long, running up alongside the house to a parking spot at the back. Nobody could get to my front door without coming up that drive. This was a Saturday in October of 2003. My wife had taken our daughter to Beckley for something, a cheerleading thing, I think. It doesn't matter. And they'd left at 8 in the morning and weren't going to be back until evening. I was home alone, which was rare enough that I remember being pleased about it. I did drafting work at the time. I had an office in the upstairs front bedroom, the one that looked out over the road, and I had a desk and a computer in there, and I'd taken a job home to finish. I'd been at it since about 9. It was a still day. I remember that clearly, no wind at all. That dead calm you get in the mountains in October when the leaves are mostly down and the air just quits moving. I had the window cracked because the wood stove downstairs had the whole house too warm. It was around 11:15. I heard the front door open, not a knock. That door had a storm door on it that had a particular sound. A metallic complaint from the closer, then the inner door, which stuck on the jamb and made a soft pop when it came free. 2 sounds in order unmistakable. I had heard them 10,000 times. And then, from the hall, my brother, hello! Exactly right, not approximately. Not a voice that reminded me of him. The pitch, the length, the drop at the end. The little laugh underneath it. 40 feet away, 1 floor down, through an open bedroom door and a stairwell. And I want to tell you what I did, because it's the thing that has made this impossible for me to put down. I was pleased. That's all. My entire reaction was, Terry's here. He lived in Chesapeake, Virginia, 4 hours away, and he did that. He'd get a wild hair and drive. He'd done it before. He'd shown up unannounced at Thanksgiving in 1998, and once at 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday in 2000. So there was nothing strange in it at all. I didn't jump. I didn't get a chill. I have never had a moment of dread attached to this, and I think that's part of why it stayed. I hollered back down. I said, hey, give me 2 seconds. I gotta save this. And there was no answer. I didn't think anything of that either, because you don't. You come in somebody's house and you holler and they holler back, and then you go put your keys down and get a drink of water. I saved the file. 60 seconds, maybe 90. I closed the program because it had a habit of hanging. And I went down those stairs. The hall was empty. The front door was closed. The storm door was closed. The little rag rug we kept inside the door was flat and dry, and there was nothing on it, and it was a dry day, so that means nothing except that I looked at it. I went through the hole downstairs. Kitchen, front room, back room. The little half bath. I called his name twice, and then I figured he'd gone back out to the car for something. A bag, a case of beer, that was the sort of thing. So I went out the front door and stood on the porch. There was no car in the drive. There was no car on the road. There was nobody in the yard. I walked the whole way down that drive to the road and looked both directions, and there was not a vehicle in sight in either direction. And that road runs straight for about 400 yards below our place before it bends. There had been no engine. I want to say that as clearly as I can. I had been sitting in an upstairs room with the window cracked on a dead still day, on a gravel road where you can hear a truck a quarter mile off, and there had been no engine, no tires, no door slam. Nothing at all before those 2 sounds at the front door. I stood in that drive for a good while, and then I did what anybody would do. I went inside and I called him. He answered on the 3rd or 4th ring. He was at his house in Chesapeake. I could hear a television. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he was watching a game and eating a sandwich. And I said, you're not in West Virginia? And he said, no. Why would I be in West Virginia? I told him. He laughed at me. He said I'd fallen asleep at my desk. And then, and this is the only strange thing he ever said about it, he got quiet for a second and he said, you all right? And I said I was fine. And he said, all right, and we talked about our mother for 10 minutes and hung up. Nothing happened. That's the thing I have to be honest about. And it's the reason this story has always disappointed people. Terry did not die that day. He did not die that week, or that month, or that year. He was fine. He drove up for Christmas of 2003 and came in that same front door and hollered that same holler. And I got up out of my chair and I had to go stand in the kitchen for a minute. He lived another 11 years. He died in April of 2014 in a hospital in Norfolk of a heart thing that had been coming for a long time and that everybody knew about. 60 years old. Not sudden, not mysterious, not on any particular day that means anything. So it doesn't line up. I want to say that plainly because I've read enough of these accounts to know that they always line up, that the voice always comes at the hour of somebody's death, and mine didn't. And I've never once been able to make it. I've had 22 years with this. Here's the boring explanation, and I've lived inside it for long stretches. I was 38. I'd been staring at a screen for 2 hours. The house was too warm. And there's a known thing where a person in that state gets a fragment of sleep they don't register. A hypnagogic intrusion, they call it. And the auditory ones are the most common kind by a long way. And they are famous for being sourced in the most familiar voice in a person's life. That's not a fringe explanation. It's the likeliest thing in the world. Every time I've told this, somebody has offered me that. And every time I have said yes, probably. But I heard the storm door. That's what I keep coming back to. And it's the smallest and least dramatic part of the whole thing. Not the voice. The voice I'll concede. The voice can come from inside a person. I understand that. But I heard the closer on that storm door, and then I heard the inner door pop off the jamb. in order with the right interval between them. I. And those are the two sounds a house makes and not the two sounds a mind makes. And I've thought about what I'd give to have that be true. And it's a great deal, and that worries me about my own testimony. I. Now here's the part I've never told at a table, with more than 2 people at it. In 2015, the year after he died, I was cleaning out some of his things with his wife. And she said something in passing about a hospital stay he'd had, and I asked when, and it was October of 2003. He'd had a cardiac event that month, not the one that got him, an early one. The one that started the whole 11-year business. And he'd been in for 4 days and he had not told me. He hadn't told our mother either. He told his wife not to call anybody because he didn't want to fuss. I asked her the date. She didn't know it exactly. She said the middle of the month. She said it was a weekend when it started because she remembered he'd been home. And that's as close as I have ever gotten, and it isn't close. It's a man with a bad heart having a bad weekend in the same month I heard a door. That's not evidence, and I know it isn't, and I've never once offered it as such. What I can't put down isn't the mystery of it. It's this. I answered him. That's the part. I sat at that desk and I heard my brother call out for me, the way he'd called out for me since I was 5 years old, and I hollered back, "Give me 2 seconds. And then I finished what I was doing 60 seconds. 90 maybe. And whatever it was gone by the time I got down there. I don't believe in much. But I have wondered every day since 2014, what would have happened if I had gotten up out of that chair right then instead? If I'd come down those stairs while it was still saying my name, and I have never been able to decide whether I'd have found nothing at all. Or whether I'd have found my brother standing in that hall in 2003, 11 years before he needed me, and I told him to wait.